This is a CAT 2022 Slot 3 RC. It's somewhere on the medium side and it's a socio-cultural RC with a little bit of politics also mixed in. So let's look at the questions first as always. Now the first question has a particular sentence which is given from the passage. So once we go through this sentence in the context of the passage and that relevant paragraph, we can look to immediately solve this question. We just need to find something which is not contradicting this statement. This is an inferential question. We have to go through these four options and figure out which is not a valid inference from the passage. That is, which cannot be inferred or which cannot be concluded based on the passage. So we'll have to read through the entire passage, understand the author's view, and then we will solve this question. Now, some of the free lessons that we have on mockat.com will help you with these kind of questions, which are pretty common in CAT. So I'll be putting the link in the description below and hope that helps you. This is a similar type of question where we'll figure out what is the author's view and particularly what is the author's conclusion. So while we'll pay attention to the view, we'll also see if there is a conclusion in the last paragraph or last few lines which can help us to select the right answer. So again, we'll be solving this once we are done with the passage. This last question is also an inferential question. It's something which has become common over the last couple of years where we need to go through the entire passage and then look at all of these words and find which one actually best captures the issues that have been discussed. So there'll be some issues and we'll have to figure out which is the correct one. Now, if you see, 3 of the 4 questions that we have are inferential questions. But the first one, which is also an inferential question, is something which we could solve while we are midway through the passage. But nevertheless, we'll focus a lot on the passage itself because we have more inferential questions. So now let's start with the passage itself. Sociologists working in the Chicago school tradition have focused on, so let's look at what is it that they focused on. They focused on how rapid or dramatic social change causes increases in crime. So if there is rapid or dramatic social change, that is something which will lead to an increase in crime. Just as we have 3 or 4 foreign names, they are basically European sociologists. Just as they thought that the rapid changes produced by industrialization and urbanization produced crime and disorder, so too did the Chicago school theorists. The location of the University of Chicago provided an excellent opportunity. Again, 3 people who are probably from the Chicago school tradition. It provided them an excellent opportunity to study the social ecology of the city. And Sean McKay found that areas of the city characterized by high levels of social disorganization had higher rates of crime and delinquency. So one quick thing is, you would have seen that I didn't spend much time on the names. If any of the names are mentioned in the passage, we can of course go back and validate. Especially foreign names will slow us down when you're reading. So it's easier to just skim and look at who they are. So in this case, they are all sociologists, they are all experts. So the main thing which we get to know from this passage is rapid or dramatic social change is something which leads to an increase in crime. So we are specifically focusing on people from the University of Chicago, sociologists who are basically studying this, and they've actually got evidence. They found that the areas which have high levels of social disorganization had higher rates of crime and delinquency. Now crime is something we'll call someone a criminal if they are an adult, if they are above 18, and if they are juvenile or under 18, they'll be called a delinquent. In case if you don't know this word, crime itself is sufficient for us to get an idea. So what we've learned is social change or disorganization is something which leads to an increase in crime. Now this is something which could happen because of industrialization and urbanization. So I'll just write that down as well. However, I do remember that this is something which is mentioned in the context of Europe and not the context of Chicago. So just for that, I'll just put a star here to remind me. So let's understand more about why this is so. In the 1920s and 1930s, Chicago, like many American cities, experienced considerable immigration. So probably this is one of the things which could lead to social change or disorganization. Rapid population growth is a disorganizing influence, but growth resulting from in-migration of very different people is particularly disruptive. So they didn't just have immigration where people were coming in. The main thing was they had in-migration. So people coming in who were very different. That was the major disruption. So this urbanization is probably caused by people who are different from the native Chicago people, the original Chicago people. Chicago's in-migrants were both native-born whites and blacks from rural areas and small towns and foreign immigrants. The heavy industry of cities like Chicago drew those seeking opportunities and new lives. Farmers and villagers from America's hinterland, like their European cousins of whom Durkheim wrote, moved in large numbers into cities. At the start of the 20th century, Americans were predominantly a rural population, but by the century's midpoint, most lived in urban areas. So what's essentially been happening? Now America is being industrialized. There's heavy industry in cities like Chicago. And as a result, white and black people from rural areas and small towns, as well as foreign immigrants, are all coming. So the main reason for this is immigration or in migration. People are migrating into Chicago. Now for this, we have white, black and foreigners. Here, we also have the sentence which is related to the question. So let's keep reading. The social lives of these migrants, as well as those already living in the cities they moved to, were disrupted by the differences between urban and rural life. So urban and rural life, there were differences. So that led to disruption of the social life. So all of these people moving in, there was disruption because of the rural-urban difference. According to social disorganization theory, now this seems to be some sociology theory, so let's pay attention. Until the social ecology of the new place can adapt, this rapid change is a criminogenic influence. So till everyone's adapted, everyone's got used to living in Chicago or other similar countries, what's happening is crime will increase. This rapid change causes a disruption which causes an increase in crime. But now, very important keyword, especially if you've gone through our lesson. So whatever's following is probably the author's view. But most rural migrants and even many of the foreign immigrants to the city looked like and eventually spoke the same language as the natives of the cities into which they moved. These similarities allowed for more rapid social integration for these migrants than was the case for African American and most foreign immigrants. So the major issue we had was for these, especially the blacks or the African Americans, which is a better term to use. I'm just writing black more as a shortcut. Reason being that the white people or the Caucasian people, as well as some of the foreigners, they looked like the natives, the original people in Chicago, and they also eventually started speaking like them. So the major disruption was because of the blacks or African Americans and a little bit because of the foreigners. So this is more important. Now at this point, let's try and see if we can solve this question. At the start of the 20th century, which is nothing but 1901, Americans were predominantly a rural population. But by the century's midpoint, which is somewhere around 1950, most lived in urban areas. So what's happened? Initially, in the beginning of the 20th century, much more Americans lived in rural areas. But by the middle of the century, there were many more people living in urban areas. So the number of people in rural areas has declined and the number of people in urban areas has increased. So which one of the following statements, if true, does not contradict or is in line with this statement? So you have to look at all of these options and find something. Now the words if true tell us that this is new information. So this information may or may not be true. We don't need to match it with the passage and see if it's true or not. Just look at this independently and see which three are contradicting this particular statement and which one is actually in line with the statement. The one in line is going to be the answer. The estimation of per capita income in America in the mid 20th century primarily required data from rural areas. Now this is wrong because we know that by the century's midpoint, most lived in urban areas. So if this is something which is true, it would actually contradict the statement. So this is not going to be a correct choice. A population consensus conducted in 1952 showed that more Americans lived in rural areas than in urban ones. So here the only thing we need to know is that the 20th century is from 1901 to 2000, and that way we can see that if in 1952 more Americans lived in rural areas, again that is contradicting this one, so we can eliminate this as well. Demographic transition in America in the 20th century is strongly marked by an out migration from rural areas. So out migration is migrating out. So in the 20th century, if the main thing of demographic transition, the transition or the movement of people is people migrating out of rural areas, this is something which is in line with the passage, because from the beginning of the 20th century to the mid 20th century, if people have gone from being predominantly rural to predominantly urban, that means people have migrated out of rural areas. So this should be the correct choice. But let's quickly validate the fourth one as well. Economists have found that throughout the 20th century, the size of the labor force has always been largest in rural areas. Again, this is suggesting that more people lived in rural areas. So this also becomes wrong. So 3 is our correct choice. Now just see an interesting thing, right? We didn't really need to know anything about social disorganization and crime or anything to solve this question. We can actually just look at this statement and solve it. Now, this is something which doesn't always occur, but let's say, this is an actual exam that you're taking and there's about a few minutes left and you come to this RC, you should not chuck it. Because if you have this question, you can still read the options and see if you are getting the answer. And in this case, you do. So this would be a way to quickly solve a question in 1 to 2 minutes without even having read the passage. But I would definitely recommend it only if you are crunched for time and you have only a few minutes left before, the VARC section is done. So now let's keep reading the passage. So we've understood so far that there's been a lot of in-migration into Chicago because it was an industrialized city. A lot of people from rural areas, white people, black people, as well as foreigners, came into the city. As a result, there was a lot of social change or disruption, which is what led to an increase in crime. The primary disruption was in the case of the African Americans and a major part also in the foreigners. The white people and many of the foreigners actually looked like the original inhabitants and even eventually started speaking like that. In these same decades, America experienced what has been called the Great Migration, the massive movement of African Americans out of the rural south and into the northern and some southern cities. Since we know that this is where the major disruption is, this sentence is telling us that this paragraph is going to explain what happened, how were the blacks' lives disrupted, and how did maybe that lead to crime. This is something which I'm of course inferring from the context and this first sentence. The scale of this migration is one of the most dramatic in human history. These migrants, unlike their white counterparts, were not integrated into the cities they now called home. Right? So they came in, but it's not real. They were not really integrated. So that is the issue. So while there was disruption, specifically for the blacks, they were not integrated. This is just the calculus symbol for integration, which I'm using as a shortcut here. In fact, most American cities at the end of the 20th century were characterized by high levels of racial residential segregation. So there was residential segregation, which is the opposite of integration. Integration is where diverse people from different races or whatever other characteristics would live together. Segregation is when these people would live separately in separate neighborhoods. Should you not know this word, we can infer it from this bit itself, right? The migrants who are not integrated is very similar to everybody was segregated. So even one of it is sufficient to infer that conditions for the African Americans were not great. Failure to integrate these migrants, coupled with other forces of social disorganization such as crowding, poverty, and illness, caused crime rates to climb in the cities, particularly in the segregated wards and neighborhoods where the migrants were forced to live. Now, because they were not integrated, there was a lot of crowding. Probably there were maybe a lot of people and not enough space. And there's also, I'll just put poor and ill instead of poverty and illness just as a shortcut. Now, all of these are essentially the causes which have led to crime in the 1920s and 30s. Foreign immigrants during this period did not look as dramatically different from the rest of the population as blacks did, but the migrants from Eastern and Southern Europe who came to American cities did not speak English and were frequently Catholic, while the native born were mostly Protestant. So there were differences in language and religion. The combination of rapid population growth with the diversity of those moving into the cities created what the Chicago school sociologists called social disorganization. So all of this together is social disorganization, and one extra thing here is language and religion were sometimes different. Again, because it is sometimes, I'll just put one more asterisk to remind me. So this just reminds me that if there's any option around this, I'll just go back and check, because it's not always that the language and religion is different. It's only in certain cases, certain specific countries are mentioned, Eastern and Southern Europe. So now that we're done with this, let's solve the remaining questions. Which one of the following is not a valid inference from the passage? So in the passage, we've understood that social disorganization where a lot of people migrate in and a diverse set of people migrate in, if they are not integrated, that is something which could lead to crime. So let's look at all these options and find something which cannot be inferred. So 3 of these options can be inferred or concluded from the passage. Whichever is not becomes the correct choice. According to social disorganization theory, the social integration of African American migrants into Chicago was slower because they were less organized. Now, there's a lot of words from the passage, social disorganization theory and all, but there's a factual error, which is one of the common elimination techniques, right? They weren't less organized, they were simply not integrated, right? It could just as well and probably was the fault of the people who were from Chicago. So this is something which cannot be inferred, and hence this actually should be the correct choice. The failure to integrate in-migrants along with social problems like poverty was a significant reason for the rise in crime in American cities. This is definitely the case. Not integrating, poverty, one more thing which is illness. So 2 of the major causes are mentioned here. So this can be inferred, so we can eliminate it. According to social disorganization theory, fast-paced social change provides fertile ground for the rapid growth of crime. Now, this is something which is mentioned over here. According to social integration disorganization theory, until the social ecology of the new place can adapt, this rapid change is a criminogenic influence. So if criminogenic influence seems a tad difficult for you, remember we've already figured out that crime is something which is increasing. That's something which we know from the beginning itself, right? Rapid or dramatic social change causes increases in crime. So this is again something which is just given in a different way, fertile ground for the rapid growth of crime, which is nothing but here there's going to be a fast increase in crime. So this is something which we can eliminate because we can infer this from the passage. The differences between urban and rural lifestyles were crucial factors in the disruption experienced by migrants to American cities. Now, when it came to the migrants, we've been told that the social life of these migrants, as well as those living in the cities they moved to, were disrupted by the differences between urban and rural life. This is also something which we just noted down over here, that the difference between the rural and the urban is what caused the disruption. So this again is something which can be inferred from the passage. So it's again wrong, and the first option is the only one which is not a valid inference from the passage. Coming to the third question, we've already understood what is the author's view. This last sentence is actually a conclusion, right? So social disorganization is caused by the combination of rapid population growth with diversity. So it wasn't same type of population, a different type or different types of people that came in. So based on this, we can see that option 1 and option 4 are the ones which are similar to what the author has concluded. Out of these, option 4, rapid population growth and demographic diversity, give rise to social disorganization that can feed the growth of crime or that can lead to a growth in crime. This is something which is exactly what the author has been saying throughout the passage and especially towards the end. The crime bit is not mentioned here, but it's mentioned throughout the passage and in the beginning, and that's the crux. So we can go for this one. Versus if you see option 1, it's actually extrapolated a little more. Is this correct? To prevent crime, it's important to maintain social order through maintaining social segregation. Yes, definitely. But this is not something which is specifically mentioned by the author, whereas option 4 is definitely mentioned. So we can eliminate option 1 only because option 4 is better. If we had only 1, 2 and 3, we definitely go with the first one. Looking at the second option, according to European sociologists, crime in America is mainly in Chicago. Now this is something which is wrong. Now the European sociologists were focusing more on Europe. Right, this is something which was also mentioned here, like the European cousins of whom Durkheim wrote. It's something we cannot assume that the Europeans were pointing fingers at Chicago. It's the sociologists who are working in the Chicago school tradition, because the University of Chicago was excellent to observe, which means that these were people who were in Chicago. They are focusing on Chicago. We've also been given examples of other cities, Detroit and Pittsburgh and all. Probably the same thing would have happened there because a lot of people have come in because of the industrialization. So there are multiple mistakes over here, and hence we can eliminate this option. It's of course also not a fundamental conclusion. The best circumstances for crime to flourish are when there are severe racial disparities. Now racial disparities, definitely we've been speaking about the African Americans and how they've been segregated the most, and that's caused major disruption and all. But this is what I call an extreme or a harsh option, because it's saying that this is the best circumstance. This is definitely one of the circumstances. Is it the best circumstance? We really can't say. We don't have comparison with other areas where crime has increased for other causes or anything like that. So whenever you have an extreme option like this, definitely make sure to double check and see if it's something the authors mentioned or have the examiners just made it more extreme. So here we can eliminate these options and go for the fourth one. Which one of the following sets of words or phrases best encapsulates the issues discussed in the passage? So the issues which have been discussed is industrialization or urbanization is something which has led to disruption. People have not been integrated or they've been segregated, either word would be fine. Crowding, poverty, illness, a lot of it has led to social disorganization, especially for certain races. So let's try and find something which is closest to this. Rapid population growth, yes, one of the issues. Heavy industry, not an issue. It is a cause which has led to this. If at all we would consider this, it would have to come ahead of rapid population growth. But more importantly, it's not exactly an issue. So ideally, I'd read on and see if there are better options. Segregation and crime both are definitely fine. Chicago School, social organization, migration and crime. Now, Chicago School is not really an issue. The other three are the ones which have been discussed in the passage, and the Chicago School is also fine because they are the ones who studied it. This is a question which I actually ended up spending a lot of time during my CAT, given that, the word issues was there, and I was like, do we go for something which has Chicago School because it is not an issue? But similarly, we have all of the other Chicago School is mentioned here, people are mentioned here, and heavy industry again, it's a cause, not really an issue. So they have not been very strict about the issue because all four options have some non-issue. So we can ignore the fact that the Chicago School is not an issue. It is definitely relevant because they are the ones who are studying and who are coming up with this. So this could be the right choice. But let's look at the other two. Chicago School again, then native born whites, European immigrants, poverty. This is not touching on the main ones. If we had to mention people of certain races, definitely the African Americans and perhaps the immigrants, the foreigners could be mentioned. Along with poverty, definitely like here we have social integration. So something around these causes would have also been better. Definitely poverty is one of the causes, but the lack of integration, the disruption, these are much more important. So option 2 is preferable to option 3. So we can eliminate both of these. It's also better than option 1 because it has the main points. Here we just have names. We have names of some of the people that are mentioned in the passage. This is really not at all the issues which are discussed. They're just some experts. So we can easily eliminate this one and go for the second option out here. So that's it then for this RC. Hopefully it was helpful and I'll see you in the next one.